So again, the uncolored in part of the pattern is referring to the wrong side of the fabric. So I'm going to flip this over again. And if I look at that illustration of how they want me to cut it, I notice that it's white. So they're saying that they really do want the wrong side of the fabric folded out. Now you'll also see that in some of these, this is also white. But if I go down to this bottom illustration, this one's gray. And this is not talking about the fabric, but this is talking about that physical pattern paper, the pattern itself. Now, if I look over here, there's another key. And this key is for the pattern paper, not for the fabric. And so you'll see if they have it colored in gray, that's the pattern printed side down. If it's clear, it's the pattern printed side up. So if I were doing, let's say, this cut here, I would have my 8 face up so I could read the 8, but my 7 would actually be flipped upside down so that it would be backwards. So I'll kind of lay it out and kind of show you an example of that. So again, get my fabric, and I want to do it just like they told me. They're saying that my salvages need to be perfectly touching. So I'm going to do that. And what you'll see me do in a lot of the videos is you'll see me kind of pushing my fabric like this. I kind of use the back of my hand to kind of make the fabric line up as perfectly as possible. If you don't have the salvages touching perfectly, you could potentially have wrinkles underneath the fabric. So I have them kind of folded, they look like they're pretty good. But if it's not perfect, what could be happening underneath this top piece could be a mess. And as you go to cut it out, you can think about cutting out maybe like Valentine's. If you cut out like a stack of paper and you're cutting out a bunch of hearts, if you're not paying attention to the back pieces, the bottom of that stack, those hearts are gonna be funny shaped. They're not gonna be perfect. We want it to be perfect. That's why when you're cutting fabric by hand with shears, you really wanna limit the number of layers. So we're really just working with 2 layers, simple. Let's just keep it as perfect as possible. So I have a fold and I have my salvages touching beautifully. And what they're telling me for my cut is they want me to lay these pants out with both of them right side up, okay? And you might not be able to see all of it, but that's okay. So they want me to lay them out with both of them right side up. That's different than that bottom illustration where they're saying leave your 8 right side up, but flip your 7 upside down. So again, if you ever see that the paper is illustrated gray, they're saying flip it over. Give me the wrong side of it, okay? So a little bit confusing, I know. Make sure that you're paying attention to those keys, separate keys for separate parts. So there's a key for pattern paper, and then there's that key for fabric. So make sure that you're looking at those and kind of just get familiar with it. That's another reason why I suggest the book that I suggest. Again, you don't have to buy a new edition of our textbook, but reading this envelope, reading this pattern paper, that's why I like the 4th edition. The imagery and the pictures are colored just like a commercial pattern, so it's really easy to work with. Okay, so I'm gonna just put this big one away, and I'm just gonna focus on my number 7 piece for now, just that one piece, my pant front. And what I want to make sure is I want to make sure that I have it laid out like the illustration shows me. So they're putting like this end here and it's facing this direction, it's upright. And I now need to pay attention to this arrow. The arrows don't always look like this, but this is very common. It's a double-sided arrow and it's a straight line. You'll see something like this arrow, or, and I'll illustrate it on here for you so you can kind of see it. You may see something that looks like, I know it's a little hard to see, like a bent arrow like this. You may see something, and there should be an illustration of it up here. Sorry, I'm looking at this upside down. They don't have an illustration of it on here. Oh, but this is a good example of it here. So it's kind of, I don't know if you can see, but it's got a bent end and a bent end there versus just kind of a straight line with the arrow on either side. This one is very specific and this one is very specific. So I'll kind of go over them both right now. What this arrow means is it wants this to be on grain. Again, if we go back to that idea of textiles and go back to that module, we talk about with woven fabric, there's grain lines. This string, this thread or this yarn that's tied to the top of the machine and down to the bottom is going to be beautifully straight, perfectly straight, nice and tight, nice and taut. All of these are going to be beautifully straight. And the ones that go across are going to be beautifully perpendicular. So what this arrow tells me is it tells me that they want the pattern piece to be perfectly lined up with a grain, and that's called a grain line. So what this says to me is that it wants my arrow to be perfectly parallel to the selvage edge. So all of the grain lines are running from top to bottom. They're all beautifully straight. And this edge here, the selvage edge here, is also beautifully, perfectly straight because it was made that way. So this arrow should be perfectly parallel to the selvage. How do I do that though? How am I supposed to, it's kind of hard to guess, right? It's kind of hard to assume. So I don't know, I'm gonna do it by eye. I'm just gonna kind of lay it down. I'm gonna try to use up as much fabric as possible. I'm gonna push it to the end and push it to the top, making sure that I have the fabric still nice and folded correctly, making sure that there's still fabric under here so I don't cut just one layer. And I'm gonna say, that looks pretty straight to me, but now I'm gonna check it. And the way that you check this is you take a pin and you're going to place it right in the middle of your double-sided arrow. These tables are beautiful, they're cork top, they're made for sewing. You have the ability to stab into them without affecting the table. So it's a little harder to do at home, but one of the things that I like to do as a trick is I buy just a large cork board, and while I'm laying out my patterns, I put a large cork board underneath my pattern, so I have the ability to poke into it and kind of adjust it like you would here in class. So just kind of a little tip. So when I start with my initial pin right in the middle of this arrow, I'm now going to take my measuring tape and I am going to measure from that pin to the edge of the fabric, the selvage edge. And I always like to make sure that I'm not using the very end of the measuring tape, but I'm using where the inch, starts. And I'm almost spot on at 8 inches. What that means is that this part of the arrow is exactly 8 inches away from the edge of the fabric. Now, if I want this line to be perfectly parallel, that means that this part of the arrow should also be 8 inches away from the edge of the fabric. And this part of the arrow should also be 8 inches away from this part of the fabric. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and take my measuring tape again. And now, I'll lay this flat. I'm going to measure from that end of the fabric to this end of the arrow. And it's pretty much spot on, but maybe I was there. Maybe, oh, look, it's 8 1/4, 8 3/8. I need to do what I call a teeter-totter and kind of realign that so that it lands at 8. And I'm going to put another pin in there. Okay? So now, again, if I go from this side, I'm at 8 inches spot on. From the middle, I'm 8 inches spot on. So hopefully on this end, hopefully I'm 8 inches spot on. And ooh, I'm not. I'm at 8 3/8. So I need to kind of pull this down. And by smoothing this out even, and measuring from there, boom. Now I'm at 8 inches. So it does require a little bit of back and forth. It definitely requires a little bit of manipulation of the pattern piece. Again, you'll see me doing kind of like a teeter-totter method when I go to cut all of my pieces out. And it's important that you do that. This line should be perfectly parallel to this line here. Once you have the pins lined up so that the grain line is perfect, then you're going to take them and you're going to lay them flat. So you're pinning them similar to the way that we do when we sew, but the only difference is that, remember when we're sewing, we pin perpendicular to the way that we're stitching. When we're cutting, we're going to pin parallel to the cut line. So I'm doing a size, let's say I'm doing a size 10. So that's what I have right here. If I'm doing a size 10, I want to make sure that I'm pinning parallel to the cut line, to that number 10 line. And I also want to make sure that I pin inside of that line. Not on the outside, but on the inside. The reason for that is because I'm going to come with my shears in a second and I'm going to start to cut on this line. If my pins are over here, then my paper and my fabric are going to be loose from each other and it's all going to flop around. I need to keep them connected until I'm absolutely done with everything that I'm doing, then I can take the pins off. So make sure again that you're pinning inside of the 10 line or whatever size you're doing, and that you're pinning parallel to your cutting line. What I will say, that a little tip is that when you get to corners, like up here at the corner of the pants, I like to put a pin diagonal so that it lands right in the corner so it holds down that point. And I also like to make sure that I'm putting a pin, I don't know, maybe like every 3 or 4 inches. Make sure that you don't have a really big gap. You don't want to just pin the corners here and have a really big hole here, because that's exactly what just happened could happen while I'm cutting. It might move and you want to make sure this lays flat. Something else you'll notice is that as I pinned these, I pinned them all the same direction. The reason for that is because we do a lot of this in sewing. We do a lot of moving of the paper and fabric. And if you've got pins going every which way, you go to do that, you're going to poke yourself and you might throw a pin out. So inside the cutting line, keep them parallel to the cutting line and make sure they're all facing the same direction, and make sure on those corners that you're doing a diagonal pin. Now, once the whole thing is pinned beautifully, then you can start to cut it out. So I'm just gonna, not pin all the way, but I'm just gonna go ahead and start cutting it because I want to show you guys these little guys here. This is the first time that we're talking about these. These are called notches. So if I look around my pattern, there's a notch there. Oh, there's 2 notches here. There's another notch here. What these are parts of the puzzle. So again, I refer to sewing as a puzzle piece. This is a puzzle piece. This is like a jigsaw puzzle. This matches another notch somewhere else. So it's really important that you identify them. So as you're cutting, you got your fabric. I'm ready to cut on my size 10. I'm using my bent handle shears. I'm not lifting the fabric because I don't want to, skew it. These aren't the best shears, so make sure yours are nice and sharp. You're cutting, you're cutting, you're cutting, and then you come on to, this little notch right here. Stop what you're doing. Don't cut across this notch, but what you want to do is you want to mirror that notch by cutting a triangle the opposite direction. So you can kind of see that this is already kind of prepared like that, so whoever cut this pattern out before did that. And so I'm going to go outwards, and I'm going to create a triangle shape. Sorry, I'm blocking you. That mirrors that triangle. This is so that as a beginner, we see from a mile away, ooh, there was a notch right there. This is, again, think about like a pattern, a puzzle piece. When you have a puzzle piece, a jigsaw puzzle piece, a certain piece matches with another jigsaw piece. That's how you can imagine these notches. So on the pant, I've got the notch that matches another notch on another part of the pattern. So it's really important that you identify those. Once you are ready, once everything is pinned down, go ahead and cut out all of the cutting lines, making sure to cut out triangles outwards for the notches. And then the last thing you're going to do is you're going to mark any type of symbols that you see. Now, symbols look different. There's a bunch of different symbols that there could be. You may have a symbol that looks like a circle, or maybe a small circle. You might have a square, or you might have something that looks like a capital I shape. There are also diamonds. There are also just like lines like this. There are also bold lines. Anything that looks like a symbol, you're going to want to identify. And you can do that with one of your marking tools, whether that be your tailor's chalk, your marking pen, or your tailor's pencil. Any of those you're going to use to identify any type of symbols. What's nice about the pattern instructions is that it also reminds you about those symbols. So you'll see on there that they have typically drawn on the pattern piece symbols, although I don't know if this one truly does. This one might not. So this one does have it written, but it actually doesn't show you the symbols. So back to the whiteboard, those are really good identifiers of what you could be looking for. Large circles, small circles, squares, it's kind of capital I shape. These ones don't have a whole lot of symbols, but when you move on to something that has a lot more detail, maybe like a button-up shirt, here are some examples of those symbols. For my size large, I want to mark a dot or a circle where that circle is. Okay? And then once you've done that for all of your pattern pieces, you're ready to start sewing. So the last thing that I'll say is that if you have fabric like mine that looks really similar on top and bottom, the last thing you'll do after you cut it on the line, after you mark all of your symbols, after you've identified all the notches, the one thing that I would highly suggest is I would suggest taking tailor's chalk and making a very soft X on the wrong side. The reason why I want you to do that is because I want you to be able to know that this is not the right side out. A nice light X with chalk tells you that. Now, because we cut this with 2 layers, we've actually cut 2 of my pant front. So I want to go to the back of this piece as well and make sure that I identify it with an X. That just tells me the wrong side of the fabric. That way I know, later on I'll make it a little bit darker for you. That way I know as I'm working with this, that that's not going to show on the outside. And then you're ready to start to sew.